April 1945. The Third Reich is burning. The war that promised glory has turned into a funeral without end. Across the smoldering ruins of Germany, the sound of artillery never stops. Entire cities are broken bones and dust. But in those ruins, one final order spreads. Every man, every boy must fight. The army is gone. The Luftwaffe is scattered. The SS is fractured. Now the Reich calls its last defenders from classrooms and youth camps, the children. In small towns across Bavaria, Saxony, and the Ruhr, the Volkssturm is formed, a desperate militia of old men and boys barely old enough to shave. Many are only 14 or 15. They were told it was their sacred duty. They wore their Father's helmets, boots that hung loose around their ankles, and oversized coats that smelled of old smoke and oil. Their rifles were rusted relics from World War I, and their hands trembled every time they pulled the bolt. One boy, we'll call him Kurt, aged 14, remembers standing in line as an officer shouted, "The Americans will show you no mercy. If captured, you will be shot like dogs." He believed it. Every boy there did. In the Hitler Youth, they'd been taught that surrender was worse than death. They sang songs about sacrifice and dying for the Führer. They painted slogans on the walls, better to fall than to yield. They thought they were heroes. They were just children. Now, as the Americans approached, the air smelled of smoke and fear. Kurt crouched behind a brick wall, gripping a Panzerfaust, a weapon taller than he was. His knees shook. His heart pounded. The propaganda voice still echoed in his head. The Americans will burn your villages. They will kill your families. They are beasts. He peeked out over the rubble. The horizon glowed red with fire. He thought of his mother, who had sent him away a year ago, saying, "Serve proudly, my son." He hadn't seen her since. He wanted to go home, but there was no home left to return to. Around him, the other boys whispered prayers. One hummed a tune he remembered from school. Another clutched a photograph of his dog. No one spoke of victory. They just waited for the sound of engines that meant the Americans were coming. When the rumble finally came, tanks in the distance, engines like thunder, the boys froze. An older Volkssturm man shouted, "Hold your ground. They'll kill you if you run." But one of them, the smallest, began to cry. He wasn't thinking about honor or death. He just wanted to go home. And that was when it hit them. This wasn't a war anymore. It was a slow ending. A generation raised for battle, sacrificed by men who'd already lost. The Americans were less than a mile away now. Dust rose from the road. Kurt wiped his tears, gripped his weapon tighter, and whispered, "They'll show us no mercy." Behind him, church bells rang one last time before the shells landed. He ducked, heart hammering, waiting for the end that he'd been told was certain. But what waited beyond those crumbling walls was not death. It was something he had never been taught to expect: kindness. They had been told mercy did not exist. But when the Americans arrived, they would learn that everything they'd been taught was a lie. The sun had barely risen when the rumble began. It wasn't thunder this time. It was the U.S. 9th Armored Division pushing through the Ruhr Valley. Tank tracks crushed the wet earth. The sound rolled through the hills like a heartbeat made of iron. In the ruins of a farming village, Kurt and the other boys waited behind a collapsed barn wall. They were cold, hungry, and shaking. The air smelled of burned hay and diesel. Every second stretched into forever. Someone whispered, "They're here." Through the smoke, the boys could see them. American tanks with white stars painted on their sides, infantry crouched behind them, rifles at the ready. The Americans moved cautiously, scanning every doorway. Kurt's hands clenched around his weapon, a Panzerfaust, the same kind of launcher that had destroyed tanks weeks earlier on these roads. He was supposed to wait until they were close enough to kill. But his arms felt too heavy. He didn't want to shoot. He didn't want to die. His friend beside him, a boy named Emil, maybe 15, whispered, "They'll shoot us if they see us." Another voice hissed, "If we surrender, they'll torture us." Every lie they'd been told echoed in their heads louder than the approaching tanks. Then, through the haze, an American soldier appeared. A sergeant, maybe 25, his face streaked with dirt, helmet low over his brow. He spotted movement behind the rubble and raised his rifle. Kurt froze. His finger brushed the trigger. Emil grabbed his sleeve, whispering, "Don't." And then the sergeant shouted, "Put it down, kid." His voice wasn't angry. It was steady. Human. Kurt blinked, stunned. He understood the words even through the fear. "Put it down, kid." For a long, terrible moment, no one moved. The world went silent. Even the tanks stopped. Kurt slowly stood, his weapon trembling in his hands. He dropped it to the ground with a hollow clatter. Emil followed, his knees shaking. The other boys stared, unsure if it was a trick. The Americans held their aim, but no one fired. One of the soldiers muttered, "Jesus, they're just kids." Another lowered his weapon. The sergeant stepped forward carefully, one hand raised, not in threat but in peace. "It's over," he said quietly. "No one's gonna hurt you." Kurt didn't believe him. He'd been told this moment would end in blood. He waited for the shot, for the pain, for the end. But it didn't come. The sergeant gestured to a medic nearby, who stepped forward holding a canteen. He handed it to the boy closest to him. The boy flinched. The soldier smiled and said softly, "It's water." The boy drank. And for the first time in years he tasted something that wasn't fear. One by one the boys emerged, pale, silent, their uniforms hanging loose, rifles abandoned in the mud. Some were crying. Others just stared, too stunned to understand what mercy looked like. The Americans looked at them, not as enemies but as children who had been lied to. And for the first time both sides saw the truth. These weren't soldiers. They were boys who'd been sent to die for a lost cause. For the first time they saw an enemy who did not want to kill them. The sergeant lowered his rifle completely and nodded. "Come on," he said gently. "You're safe now." The boys followed, not out of obedience but out of exhaustion, out of disbelief. As they walked toward the American convoy, Kurt looked back once at the ruined village behind him. The walls, the flag, the lies. He whispered to himself, "They said you were monsters." Then he turned and followed the men who just proved otherwise. But what waited for them next wasn't punishment. It was something they had forgotten existed: kindness. The boys were marched down a dirt road, their boots squelching in the mud. Rain began to fall again, thin, cold, and endless, the kind that seeps into your bones. They didn't speak. No one dared to. Every sound, the crunch of tank treads, the jingle of American gear, felt like a countdown to something terrible. Their officers had always said, "If the Americans take you, they'll kill you. Quickly if you're lucky." That lie clung to them like smoke. Kurt kept his eyes on the ground. His stomach growled, but fear made it hard to feel hunger. Next to him, Emil muttered a prayer under his breath. As they reached a small field, the Americans stopped. The sergeant, the same man who'd shouted, "Put it down, kid," spoke with a medic, then waved the group forward. The boys stood in a line, trembling. Kurt braced for the order, the one that would make them kneel. But instead, an American walked up holding a canteen. He offered it to the first boy in line. The boy flinched. The soldier waited. Finally, the boy reached out, eyes wide, expecting it to be a trick. He drank and gasped. It was water. Cold, clean water. The soldier smiled slightly and patted his shoulder before moving on to the next. Kurt stared in disbelief. Then another soldier approached, holding something wrapped in brown paper. He tore it open and handed Kurt a piece. It was chocolate. The smell hit him first, sweet, unreal. He hadn't tasted sugar in months. He hesitated, then took a small bite. The flavor exploded in his mouth, too rich, too good to be real. For a moment he forgot where he was. He looked up, half expecting the soldier to laugh, to shout, "See? Poison." But the man only nodded and said something he barely understood. "You're all right, kid. Eat." Behind him, another soldier was handing out bread, thick, white slices, still warm. One of the boys began to cry, his face streaked with mud and tears. He wasn't crying from fear this time, but from relief. A real POW from the Ruhr pocket once said, "An American gave me a sandwich. I wept." That moment, a sandwich, became more powerful than any weapon. The boys' training began to unravel inside them. The lies didn't hold anymore. They'd been told the enemy was a beast. But this enemy was feeding them. Some couldn't even chew. They just held the food in their hands, staring at it, trying to understand how kindness could exist here. Emil whispered, "Why would they do this?" Kurt didn't know. None of them did. One soldier noticed the boy shivering and took off his own jacket, placing it over his shoulders. He said something quiet, maybe "Stay warm," maybe "You're safe." The words didn't matter. The tone did. For the first time the boys saw an American not as a monster, but as a man. The youngest one, barely 13, looked up at his captor and stammered in broken English, "You not kill?" The soldier shook his head. "No," he said softly. "It's over." That word, over, hung in the air. No gunfire. No screaming. Just the sound of rain on helmets and the soft rustle of wrappers as frightened children ate in silence. The fear that had held them hostage for years began to crack. Slowly, painfully, beautifully. Kurt felt his throat tighten. His whole life he'd been told the enemy had no soul. But now the only people treating him like a human being, were the ones he'd been told to hate. He swallowed another bite of chocolate, tears in his eyes. "They lied to us," he whispered. The sergeant looked at him but said nothing. "You didn't have to. They had been ready to die. Instead, they were being fed." But for these boys, the greatest shock wasn't what the Americans gave them, it was what they didn't take. By afternoon, the rain had stopped. Smoke drifted over the fields where the tanks stood idle. The war, at least here, was over. The boys sat in a line near a makeshift field kitchen, their hands wrapped around tin cups, their eyes downcast. Steam rose from large metal pots, carrying the smell of meat, onions, and broth, a smell so comforting, so human, it felt like another trick. Kurt watched as American cooks ladled stew into bowls. He hadn't seen this much food since before the bombings. But no one moved. They just sat there waiting. They had all heard the same stories. If they feed you, it's poison. They want to make you talk. A corporal knelt down in front of them, wiping sweat from his brow. He motioned to one of the boys, the smallest, maybe 13, and handed him a bowl. The boy's hand shook. He looked up, eyes wide with terror. He didn't touch the food. He whispered something in German. "Gift. Poison." The soldier frowned, not understanding at first. Then it clicked. He smiled softly, took the bowl back, and with exaggerated slowness, tasted a spoonful himself. He swallowed, smiled again, and nodded. "See? Not poison." The boy blinked, confused. Then slowly he reached out and took it. He ate a small bite, then another, then another. It was hot, salty, and rich with flavor. It burned his tongue, but he didn't stop. He hadn't tasted warmth in years. Around him, the other boys began to eat too, cautiously at first, then faster, desperate, animal-like. The Americans didn't laugh or mock. They just watched quietly. One soldier took out a chocolate bar from his pocket, broke it in half, and handed it to Kurt. Kurt hesitated. The man smiled. "Go on, kid." Kurt took it, the corners of his mouth twitching into something he hadn't felt in a long time, a smile. Then something unexpected happened. One of the soldiers tripped over a fuel canister, spilling coffee all over his boots. He cursed, jumped back, and started laughing. The sound startled the boys. Laughter hadn't existed in their world for months. But then one of them, Emil, laughed too. A soft, nervous laugh that turned into a real one. Within seconds, the tension broke. The field filled with the sound of children laughing for the first time in years. It wasn't joy. It was release. The kind that comes when fear finally cracks. A witness years later described it this way. "The crying boy broke my heart. They weren't soldiers anymore, just kids who'd been freed from lies." The soldiers began handing out coffee, bread, even cigarettes they knew the boys were too young for. It wasn't charity. It was instinct. The kind you have when you see a reflection of your own son, your own brother, your own humanity. Kurt held his cup carefully, the smell of coffee rising like a memory he didn't have. He didn't like the taste, but he drank it anyway. It made him feel older, part of something that wasn't war. One soldier ruffled his hair. Another handed him a spoonful of sugar to sweeten it. The simple kindness felt unreal. And for the first time, the boys began to talk, quietly, clumsily, mixing broken German and English. "Why?" one asked, gesturing around. "Why you not kill?" The American shrugged. "Because the war's done, son. You can stop fighting now." The boys stared at him, not sure what to do with that answer. For years they'd been told mercy was weakness. But sitting there, full and warm, they learned it was the strongest thing they'd ever seen. The field was quiet again. Only the wind, the smell of stew, and the soft sound of spoons scraping empty bowls. Kurt looked down at the last bite of bread in his hand. He held it for a long moment, then whispered, "Each bite feels like forgiveness." He didn't know why he said it, but everyone understood. Each bite was a lesson they were never meant to learn. But even behind barbed wire, they would soon discover that kindness was not a moment, it was a way of survival. The convoy rolled slowly toward the temporary POW camp on the edge of the Ruhr. What had once been a farm was now surrounded by tall wire fences and watchtowers, not for cruelty but for order. Inside, rows of khaki tents lined the muddy field. Smoke from small stoves drifted into the pale spring sky. To the boys it looked like another prison. But what waited inside would change everything they thought they knew about enemies. The American guards didn't shout. They didn't kick or curse. They simply guided the boys toward a tent marked with a red cross, the medical station. Inside, a medic with tired eyes and rolled-up sleeves cleaned their cuts and smeared ointment over infected scratches. When one boy flinched, the medic said softly, "Easy there, buddy. Won't hurt long." The boy didn't understand the words, but he recognized the tone. gentle, patient, human. After that, they were handed blankets, real warm ones. Most hadn't slept under anything soft in months. That night, as rain pattered against the tents, they lay quietly in rows, listening to the strange silence of safety. No bombs. No orders. No shouting. Just breathing. Kurt couldn't sleep. He looked across the tent and saw one of the Americans, the same sergeant from the village, sitting by a lantern reading a letter from home. The man noticed him watching and smiled. "Hello," he said slowly, tapping his chest. "Me, Joe." Then he pointed at Kurt. "You?" Kurt hesitated. He pointed at himself. "Kurt." Joe nodded. Then he repeated the word, "Hello." He gestured for Kurt to try. Kurt frowned, then whispered awkwardly, "Hello." Joe laughed, not mockingly but warmly. He gave a thumbs up. "Good," he said. "Hello, Kurt." For the first time the boy smiled back. The next day the camp came alive in routine. They lined up for breakfast, oatmeal and bread always warm. Afterward, some worked in the garden or helped repair tents. Others wrote letters on small scraps of paper provided by the Americans. One of the guards told them, "We'll make sure these get home." Many of the boys didn't even know if home still existed. Still they wrote, "Dear Mother, I am alive. The Americans are not monsters." Some folded the letters carefully, as if holding a fragile truth for the first time. In the afternoons, music played from a small radio in the guard post. Swing songs, big bands, voices full of joy. At first, the boys didn't know what to make of it. But soon they began humming along. A few even clapped. One day Joe walked by and tossed a baseball toward the fence. It bounced once and rolled to Kurt's feet. He stared at it, confused. Joe motioned for him to throw it back. Kurt did. The ball wobbled through the air and landed short. Joe laughed and tossed it again. By the fifth throw, the boy was smiling without realizing it. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Kurt and Joe sat near the wire, talking through gestures and broken words. Kurt pointed at Joe's rifle leaning against the wall. He mimed fear, hands raised. Joe shook his head. "Not anymore," he said. "War's done." Kurt tilted his head. "We're done?" Joe nodded. Then, after a moment of quiet, Kurt said softly, "You, not monster." Joe looked at him for a long second. Then he smiled, tapping his own chest. "Neither are you." Over time, the guards began calling the younger POWs the kids. They gave them extra rations, let them help in the kitchen, even taught them to play cards. Kurt learned a few more English words. Yes. Thank you. Coffee. Friend. For boys who'd been raised to die, it felt like learning to live. That night, Kurt lay under his blanket, the smell of soup still on his hands. He thought of the teacher who told him Americans were devils. He thought of the sergeant's smile. And for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a soldier. He felt like a child again. They arrived as enemies and were treated like sons. But as kindness healed their bodies, guilt began to haunt their minds, because mercy can feel heavier than punishment. The nights in the camp were quiet, too quiet for boys who had grown up with sirens and gunfire. The silence pressed against them like a new kind of sound. Inside the tents, shadows moved softly across canvas walls. The boys lay awake, whispering, afraid not of guards or punishment, but of something they couldn't name, guilt. Kurt lay staring at the roof of his tent. The smell of soap and clean fabric still felt foreign. Across from him, Emil turned on his side and whispered, "Kurt, how can they be kind after what we did?" Kurt didn't answer. He didn't know how. He remembered the villages they'd passed through, the broken windows, the burned barns, the mothers crying. He remembered throwing stones at captured Allied airmen because an officer told him to. He remembered believing it was right. Now, every act of kindness from these Americans cut deeper than punishment ever could. At the far end of the tent, another boy, older, 16 maybe, whispered, "My teacher said the Americans were demons." He paused. "If that's true, what does that make us?" No one spoke. The only sound was rain pattering softly on canvas. Emil rolled over, voice trembling. "We burned their towns," he said quietly, "and they spared us." The words hung in the air, heavier than any weapon. In the days that followed, the laughter from the kitchen grew fainter. The boys still ate, still played ball with the soldiers, but something inside them had changed. One morning, Kurt was helping peel potatoes when he saw a small American photo on the table, a soldier's family. A wife, 2 little kids, smiling. He stared at it for a long time. The soldier noticed, picked it up, and said proudly, "That's my boy." Kurt nodded slowly, whispering, "My age." The soldier smiled and went back to work, humming softly. Kurt felt something twist inside him. He realized this man had a son, a child who might have been told that German boys were monsters too. But somehow the man still found space for kindness. And Kurt, who had never been taught mercy, suddenly wanted to learn it. That night he couldn't sleep again. He wrote in a scrap of paper he'd saved from the kitchen. They feed us. They smile at us. They see us as children. I do not know how to carry this. The shame didn't come from being captured. It came from realizing what mercy looked like, and knowing they'd never shown it to anyone else. In later years, survivors from the Hitler Youth Divisions wrote about this same feeling in their memoirs. One wrote, "We expected cruelty but received kindness. It broke something inside us. It made us question everything we believed." For these boys, the camp was not just a prison. It was a mirror. And what they saw in that reflection was both unbearable and freeing. One evening, Joe, the American sergeant, sat near the wire tossing pebbles into the mud. Kurt walked up quietly and asked in broken English, "Why, you good to us?" Joe looked up, thinking for a moment. Then he said simply, "Because the war's over." Kurt frowned. "War over?" Joe nodded. "Yeah. You don't have to hate anymore." Kurt didn't reply. He just nodded slowly, the meaning sinking in like sunlight through fog. When he turned to leave, Joe added softly, "That's the hardest part, learning how to stop fighting." That night, Kurt lay awake again, staring at the stars through a gap in the tent flap. He thought of the boys still out there, still fighting, still believing the lies. He thought of his teacher, his commanders, his parents, all trapped in the same illusion. He didn't know if forgiveness was real, but he knew what it felt like to receive it. And that was heavier than any guilt he had ever known. Mercy felt heavier than punishment. But mercy was only the beginning. The world outside the barbed wire was about to end, and these boys would learn that even freedom can feel like loss. The sky over Germany turned quiet. No more bombers. No more flares. No more gunfire echoing through the valleys. Only wind. Only silence. It was May 8, 1945, the day Germany surrendered. The day the war officially ended. But for the boys behind barbed wire, it felt like the day the world stopped existing. In the camp yard, the American soldiers stood around a radio. The broadcast crackled with static before a voice finally came through, deep, formal, unmistakable. Unconditional surrender of all German forces. The guards removed their helmets and bowed their heads. Across the fence, the boys watched in stunned silence. They couldn't understand the English words, but they understood the tone. It was over. Some of them cheered softly, out of confusion, out of relief. Others stared at the ground. A few began to cry. Kurt just stood there, the wind brushing his hair, staring at the flag on the guard post, the American flag, fluttering in the soft morning light. He whispered, "The Reich is gone?" No one answered. Later that afternoon, the camp's sergeant walked through the rows of tents, explaining what had happened through an interpreter. "Germany has surrendered. You are now prisoners of peace." The words didn't make sense. Prisoners of peace. It sounded like something out of a dream. The boys gathered in small groups, whispering, trying to imagine a world without war. Emil asked, "Do you think we'll go home?" Kurt shrugged. He didn't even know if home still existed. A few days later, the first letters began to arrive, smuggled through the Red Cross. Some were just fragments, others short notes scrawled in pencil. One read, "Our town is gone. Father is missing. Come home if you can." Another, "We heard you were captured. Thank God. You are alive." Each letter was both a miracle and a wound. They had survived, but their world had not. That evening, as the sun set behind the hills, the camp's loudspeaker played soft music, a sign of celebration across Europe. The Americans smiled. Some even danced. But the boys couldn't join. Emil sat on his cot, reading the same letter over and over. "Mother, gone." He folded it carefully, his hands trembling. Kurt sat beside him, silent. After a long pause, Emil said, "We were supposed to die for Germany." Kurt looked at him. Germany died instead. The words came out hollow, like something he didn't want to believe. That night, the guards brought extra food, celebration rations. Bread, potatoes, even a little fruit. The boys ate quietly. No laughter this time. Joe, the American sergeant, sat across the fence, smoking. He noticed Kurt watching and raised his coffee mug in a silent toast. Kurt nodded back, managing a faint smile. Weeks later, rumors spread that they'd soon be sent home. Some were overjoyed, others terrified. They had been safe here. They didn't know what waited outside. When the day finally came, the gates opened and trucks lined the dirt road. The guards helped them load their few belongings. Before boarding, Kurt walked up to Joe and saluted awkwardly. Joe shook his head and extended his hand instead. Kurt hesitated, then shook it. Joe smiled. "You made it, kid." Kurt tried to speak but couldn't. His throat closed. He managed to whisper, "Thank you." Joe looked at him, the boy who had once pointed a gun at him, and said, "Don't thank me. Just live." The trucks rumbled away, carrying the boys back to a country that no longer existed the way they remembered it. Behind them, the camp grew smaller, fading into the haze. Kurt looked out the window, watching the fences disappear. He thought about the chocolate, the laughter, the coffee, the man who called him kid. He whispered to himself, "They fed us, they forgave us, and we lived." The enemy who fed them had also freed them. But freedom was not the end of their story, it was the beginning of their guilt, their rebuilding, and the memories that refused to fade. The trucks crossed what had once been the German frontier, now a land of ruin. Fields where wheat once grew were cratered and gray. Churches without steeples. Towns without names. Signs bent sideways like broken prayers. For the boys who had been captured months earlier, this wasn't a return, it was a revelation. The war they'd been taught to fight for had eaten everything it promised to protect. As Kurt stepped off the transport, the smell of smoke hit him first, faint but endless. A Red Cross volunteer guided them through what was left of a railway station. No roof, no windows, just hollow walls filled with wind. He carried nothing but a small bag and a letter from the camp, confirming he had been treated humanely under Allied supervision. The irony cut deep. The paper in his pocket had survived better than his homeland. He walked for miles along roads lined with rubble until he reached the outskirts of his town. The school he'd once attended was a shell. The bakery was gone. Even the river seemed smaller, choked with debris and ash. When he reached the small cottage where his family used to live, the door hung open. Inside, silence. No one. On the back wall, written in chalk, were the words, "Gone east to find food, Mother and Lee's." Kurt stood there for a long time, unable to move. He finally sat on the floor, tracing the handwriting with his fingers. It was hers. He whispered, "I'm home, Mama." But there was no answer. Days turned to weeks. He slept in ruins, helped neighbors clear debris, shared what little the Allied relief trucks brought. He watched older men, once officers, now sweeping streets with brooms made from twigs. No one spoke of pride anymore. Only survival. One morning, Kurt met an American convoy distributing supplies to civilians. To his shock, one of the soldiers recognized him. "Kid from the camp." The man laughed. It was Joe. They shook hands again, this time on the same side of the wire. Joe handed him a can of condensed milk and a blanket. Kurt hesitated before taking it. "You're still helping us?" Joe shrugged. "We're done fighting, remember?" Kurt looked at the can, the simple mercy of food, and said quietly, "You kept your word." Joe smiled, then said, "Now you keep yours." Kurt frowned. "What word?" Joe tapped his chest. "Live." That night, as the moon rose over the ruins, Kurt sat by the river and opened the can with a piece of metal. He drank slowly, the sweet taste burning his throat. It reminded him of the chocolate at the camp, the first gift of peace. He closed his eyes. For a moment he was back behind the barbed wire, safe and warm. He almost wished he was there again. Because out here, freedom felt colder than captivity. Months later, aid stations helped him find a job unloading cargo for Allied relief units. He was 16, thinner than ever, but determined to build something again. Each time he saw the Americans, he felt the same ache of gratitude and shame. In one of his letters he wrote, "They defeated us with kindness. That is the wound that never heals." By 1946, he found his mother and sister in a refugee camp near Munich. When she saw him, she wept so hard she couldn't speak. He showed her the Allied letter and the can of milk he had saved as proof of mercy. She held his face in her hands and whispered, "They taught you to be human again." That night, he sat outside their tent and watched the campfires flicker against the dark. Children laughed somewhere nearby, playing free alive. He thought of Emil, of the others, of the boys who never came back. He thought of Joe and the word that had followed him through everything, live. He whispered to himself, "I'm trying." They returned to ashes, but carried something their broken country needed most, the memory of mercy. Years later, the world would forget their faces, but their story would outlive every empire that told them to hate. 20 years passed. The boys who once huddled behind barbed wire had become men, teachers, builders, fathers. The war lived inside them still, like a shadow that never quite left the room. Kurt, now 40, taught history at a small school outside Hamburg. Every spring when his students asked about the war, he would pause, look out the window, and change the subject. He could teach about maps, strategies, and treaties, but not about mercy. That part still hurt too much. One day in 1965, a letter arrived from the United States. The return address read, Joseph Miller, St. Louis, Missouri. Kurt froze. He hadn't seen that name since 1945. His hands trembled as he opened it. Dear Kurt, I still remember you. I saw a picture in a magazine last month. German students rebuilding schools after the war. One looked just like the boy who shook my hand at the camp. If you're alive, I hope you've done what I asked. Joe. Kurt read it 3 times before realizing he was crying. He folded the letter carefully, like it might break if he held it too hard. That summer, he flew to America for the first time, part of a post-war exchange program for teachers. He kept Joe's address in his jacket pocket. When he arrived at St. Louis Airport, a man in his 50s was waiting, holding a small cardboard sign that simply read, Kurt. Their eyes met. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Joe smiled, the same calm, tired smile Kurt remembered through the fence, and said, Took you long enough, kid. Kurt laughed, half sobbing, and they embraced like brothers separated by history. That night, they sat on Joe's porch, 2 cups of coffee steaming between them. Joe's wife brought pie, and they talked until the cicadas went quiet. Kurt told him everything, the ruins, the loss, the rebuilding. Joe listened quietly, then said, We all lost something. But not everyone got a chance to build again. They sat in silence for a while, both staring at the stars. Finally, Kurt said, You told me to live. And you did, Joe replied. You're sitting right here, ain't you? Over the next few years, Kurt wrote articles about post-war forgiveness, small essays published in local papers. One line from his writing became famous across Germany. The first freedom I ever knew was when my enemy gave me bread. He never mentioned names, but those who had lived it knew exactly what he meant. In 1985, the 40th anniversary of the war's end, Kurt stood before his students once more. He was older now, gray-haired, soft-spoken, still carrying the gravity of memory. He showed them a faded photograph, boys in oversized uniforms sitting on the ground eating from tin bowls. One smiled. One cried. The caption read simply, Captured Hitler Youth, 1945. Kurt looked at his class and said, That boy was me. The students went silent. He continued, They told us the Americans were monsters. They were wrong. Monsters don't feed their enemies. They don't forgive. After class, one student lingered. A quiet boy, maybe 14, the same age Kurt had been. He asked softly, Sir, were you scared? Kurt smiled faintly. Yes, but mercy scared me more than bullets. The boy looked confused. Kurt leaned down and added, Because it forced me to question everything I believed. Years later, when Kurt died, his students found the letter from Joe tucked inside his journal, creased, worn, but perfectly preserved. Beside it was a single sentence written in his own hand. He fed me once. I've spent the rest of my life trying to feed others. Mercy does not erase the past. It rewrites what it means to survive it. History remembers wars by who won them, but humanity remembers by who chose compassion when no one expected it. April 1945 had ended, but its echo never did. The war faded. The guns went silent. Yet somewhere, deep inside the men who had once been boys, a quieter battle continued, the one between hatred and mercy. Those children, the ones who had trembled behind Panzerfaust and propaganda, grew into men who could never forget the moment they were spared. They had seen what mercy looked like when it wore an enemy's uniform. Historians would call them the children of collapse. But they called themselves something different, the lucky ones. They had walked through a world that told them compassion was weakness. And they survived long enough to learn that kindness was the only strength that mattered. When asked about the war, many could not speak. Not about battles. Not about orders. But about food. A sandwich. A piece of chocolate. A blanket. Small things that, for them, meant life, and the beginning of truth. One former prisoner said, They didn't just feed us. They freed us from the lies we were born into. Another wrote, We were ready to die as monsters. They let us live as men. The years passed. The uniforms disappeared. The borders blurred. But the memories remained, carried quietly, like an old scar that still aches when it rains. Some returned to America not as enemies but as immigrants. Others raised children who would never wear a uniform again. And every now and then one of them would say it, softly like a prayer. I owe my life to someone who should have hated me. History remembers wars by who won them. But humanity remembers who refused to become what war demanded. Mercy didn't end the conflict, but it rewrote its meaning. Those boys grew into living proof that compassion can survive the darkest century. April 1945 began with children clutching rifles. It ended with those same children learning that mercy could be stronger than any army. Empires fell. Nations rebuilt. But one truth remained: the smallest kindness can outlive every war. You've just heard what mercy looks like in the middle of hell. Now think about this. If one small act of kindness could change the life of a frightened boy in 1945, how many stories like this are still buried in the ashes of history? We find them. We tell them. And every time you subscribe, you keep those forgotten moments alive. The ones that remind us who we really are when the world forgets. So if this story stayed with you, don't just scroll past. Leave a comment. Tell me what you felt. Because this channel isn't about war, it's about what survives it. Hit subscribe, and be here when the next true story of courage, mercy, and impossible humanity begins.